So, in today's presentation, first we'll be discussing about mental health in general. So, in mental health, we are going to also then discuss about what are the factors which determine mental health. How can one identify these factors and deal with some of these factors? Now, this presentation has been made keeping in mind the university students. So, this is going to be our target audience for this presentation. Subsequently, we'll be discussing about stress, lifestyle, time management, study skills, memory, emotions, principles and components of learning, and distinguishing normality and abnormality. So let's move on to discuss about mental health. Mental health is a state of well-being in which an individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. It is a more than absence of mental disorders. So we have to look beyond mental disorders concept. And poor mental health is associated with stressful work conditions and unhealthy lifestyle. So let's move on to see the first factor which determines mental health, that is stress. Now, it is a strain on a person's adaptive capability that causes an interruption of the person's routine or habitual functioning. An imbalance between the demands made on the individual and the ability to cope with these demands. It interferes with systems' physiological and psychological homeostasis. So, to simply understand, stress is a necessary evil. An analogy to this would be that stress is like electricity. It gives energy, increases human arousal, and affects performance. But if this electric current is too high, then the bulbs may fuse, the appliance may get damaged, and so does the body. So this picture discusses the Selye's general adaptation syndrome. So there are 4 components to it. As I mentioned, the body is always in a state of homeostasis. Okay. So when when any kind of stress is put on the body, it enters the alarm stage. This is the stage where the sympathetic arousal happens and the body starts preparing for a fight or flight response. Now slowly with time, it enters into the resistance stage. Now this stage is where the parasympathetic activity begins and the body is able to cope with this stress. However, if this stress continues over time and it is lasting for a longer period of time than expected, then the body will enter into the stage of exhaustion. Now let's introduce another concept here, that is diathesis. The word diathesis stems from the Greek idea of predisposition, a constitutional vulnerability to develop a disorder that is an internal or an endogenous process. Now this predisposition can be single or can have multiple factors, and it is considered to be latent and it requires some kind of activation which could be through a stress. So let's talk about the diathesis stress model, which is an explanatory model for how an individual copes with stress. So all people have some level of diathesis or predisposition for any given mental illness. However, individuals may differ regarding the point at which they develop a disorder depending on the degree to which a predispositional risk factor exists within them and the degree of stress experienced. So let us look at this graph which talks about, so if you look at the vulnerability continuum, so you have an individual being vulnerable and then on the other spectrum you have that individual is resilient. Now every individual has a different threshold of stress. You can see that there is a line which talks about the threshold of an individual. So if an individual is more resilient, then the threshold for him to develop any form of imbalance in this homeostasis is going to be high for a given amount of stress compared to those individuals who are vulnerable. So resilience is nothing but the factors that make a person resistant to the deleterious effects of stressors. Now this resilience could be because of some personality traits, some social skills, or the way they respond or cope with the stress. And when resilience increases, the risk of disorder goes down, but it does not entirely vanish. So we can see that there are various factors which are clubbed under diathesis and stress. So an individual can have a biological predisposition in the forms of some altered biochemistry, genes, or brain anomalies, some social factors such as maladaptive upbringing, chronic stress, or psychological factors like poor skills or maladaptive cognitions. Whereas there are some examples of stress which have been highlighted. Some biological triggers like onset of a disease, exposure to some toxins, social triggers like traumatic experiences, major loss, or psychological triggers like perceived loss of control, violation of trust, etc. So when these two factors combine, that is the diathesis and the stress, it gives rise to complex behavioral phenotypes which manifest in the form of mental illnesses. So let's look at some of the signs of stress. Now, stress can manifest in various forms. Some of the somatic symptoms are headaches, body aches, backaches, chest pain, fatigue, joint pains. Some of the behavioral symptoms are when individual starts appearing hostile, isolated, there is a lot of avoidance seen, crying, seen withdrawn, has substance use, or there's excessive browsing of the internet. Some cognitive symptoms or thought symptoms are confusion, decreased concentration, impaired memory, disorientation, and poor judgment. And biological symptoms being inability to fall asleep or inability to maintain sleep, also known as insomnia, reduced appetite, decreased libido, and altered bowel habit. Now, there are various ways in which stress can be managed. The first and foremost is that the individual needs to acknowledge and understand, identify that yes, he is stressed out. Apart from that, there are some other ways which we will be discussing in the subsequent slides. However, I have enlisted them here. These could be making lifestyle changes in diet, scheduling one's day, maintaining routine activities, sleep, relaxation, coping skills, that is a set of efforts made to reduce the impact of the stressful events, ability to manage their emotions. We are going to discuss about these things in the subsequent slides. Problem solving and decision making, managing one's time, being assertive, having right communication skills, hobbies, spirituality, social and family support, and work-life balance. So largely, when we understand how an individual copes with stress, there are two ways. One is a problem-focused strategy, the other is the emotion-focused strategy. So problem-focused strategies basically attack the problem itself. That is, they are behaviors designed to alter the event. Now, they increase the person's awareness, level of knowledge, and the range of behavioral and cognitive coping options. So, they can reduce the threat of the value to the event. For example, I was panicking about the exams, so I scheduled my reading hours and followed that for the exam. So, you have prepared a particular solution for the problem at hand and worked on it. There is another way of dealing with stress, that is emotion-focused strategies. These are basically psychological changes designed primarily to limit the degree of emotional disruption caused by an event with minimal effort to alter the event itself. For example, I talked about or I ventilated about the problem to my friend to let it out of my system, and I feel so light now. So here you are actually manipulating your emotions. Now, let's take some of these things that we have discussed in a little bit more detail here. So first, I'll be discussing about lifestyle in general, which will be discussing about sleep, appetite, how one can manage time, etc. So, to set the premise for this, let's look at this meta-analysis and systematic review by Castro et al. In 2020. Now, the objective of this meta-analysis and systematic review was to synthesize the evidence on the level of sedentary behavior in university students. and 125 studies were included in this particular study. What they found was that university students spend 7.29 hours per day being sedentary, and computer use presented significantly higher prevalence over other modalities of screen time. And among the explored factors, which were country's income, age of the individual, gender, and studies publication date, only the publication date significantly moderated sedentary behavior, and sedentary time has increased over the last 10-year period. So, students engage in higher levels of sedentary time compared to general young adult population, and they accumulate levels of sedentary time that have been associated with an increased risk of detrimental health outcomes. So, irrespective of the country you belong or your gender, there is a finding that says that individuals going to universities are spending a lot of time being sedentary, and that is detrimental to your health. So let's discuss some of the lifestyle modifications that is recommended by the WHO in 2019. So the WHO gives certain recommendations of a healthy diet, which is combination of different foods, that is fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and whole grains. For adults, at least 5 portions, that is 400 grams of fruits and vegetables per day need to be served, and these should be there should be a wide variety of these fruits, and these should be seasonal fruits or vegetables. And the salt intake should be restricted to 5 grams, that is 1 teaspoon per day. One can do this by limiting the uses of sauces or processed food. Sugar intake should be restricted to 50 grams, that is 12 teaspoons per day, which is equivalent to less than 10% of the total energy, and less than 5% if an individual is able to maintain of the total energy, then he will have additional health benefits. Now, use of fats should be less than 30% of the total energy intake, in which saturated fats should be less than 10%, trans fats should be less than 1%, and unsaturated fats are the good fats. Now, examples of unsaturated fats are sunflower oil, olive oil, fish oil, soybean, etc. Whereas saturated fats are ghee, butter, and trans fats are basically found in processed foods such as chips and all of that. And there is no safe level of alcohol use or tobacco use. Now, moving on to the recommendations for physical activity. The amount of physical activity you need depends on your age, but in general, for adults who are aged between 18 to 64 years, should do at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity throughout the week. And for additional benefits, they may also increase the moderate intensity physical activity to up to 300 minutes per week. Now, let's discuss some of the sleep hygiene techniques that have been discussed. Now, sleep hygiene is defined as behaviors that one can do to help promote good sleep using behavioral interventions. Now, some of the sleep hygiene measures are to maintain a regular sleep routine, avoid daytime naps, not to stay in bed awake for more than 5 to 10 minutes. Don't watch TV or use the computer or read on bed. Have designated areas where you would be doing these things. Drink caffeinated drinks with caution. Avoid inappropriate substances that interfere with sleep, especially during the evenings and the night times. Try and get as much as clean, fresh air. Exercise before 2 p.m. every day as it promotes continuous sleep. Have a quiet, comfortable bedroom. If you are a clock watcher at night, hide the clock. You don't want to be constantly disturbed looking at the clock if you're unable to fall asleep. Have a comfortable pre-bedtime routine. Have a warm bath or shower just before your sleep, or some form of meditation or quiet time. Now, these have been prescribed by the American Sleep Association. Now, let's move on to time management, which again comes in our lifestyle. So, time management is basically the act or process of planning and exercising conscious control over the time spent on specific activities, especially to increase effectiveness, efficiency, or productivity. And the goals of time management are the aim of managing time is to spend time doing the things that help you achieve your goals and the things that you personally prioritize and value. And to be able to have a control over your life, manage your time and don't let it manage you. This is the importance of time management. First, that time is limited and we have to accomplish more with less effort, make better decisions, reduce stress, and create some amount of discipline in life. So these are some of the tips for effectively managing time. First of all, be organized, use appointment calendars or to-do lists. Plan, because once you have planned things, you have scheduled it, then it will happen. Prioritize your task. So there is this Eisenhower method of prioritizing tasks. If you see, you can actually divide this particular task based on how urgent or important it is. So the strategy is to basically categorize your tasks as to whether they are important and urgent, important but not urgent, not important and urgent, and not important and not urgent. Now, things like exercise or vacation planning are definitely important, but they are not urgent, so they can actually be pre-planned. However, they can be certain emergency things or new deadlines that might come up, which might be categorized as urgent and important and may need to be pushed up on your priority list. Whereas there are certain things which are urgent but not important, like some form of distractions, interruptions from other calls, which one may curtail and bring down. And there are some other things which you don't find useful at all. They are neither urgent, not important. Try and push them out of your life as they're not really important and they're just wasting your time. So you can use this Eisenhower method to effectively plan your day. There are other things like avoid overload, practice effective study techniques, be flexible and realistic, have a vision, delete work which is unimportant, because time is going to be constant and work is going to pile up, but things which are not important should be deleted. And reward yourself when you do something or when you have achieved something, because that kind of reinforces you to do more things. Now let's look at this meta-analysis by Aon et al. 2021, which had looked into whether time management really works. So this was a meta-analysis to assess the impact of time management on performance and well-being. And the results that have been found are that time management is moderately related to work performance, academic achievement and well-being. And it also shows a moderate negative relationship with distress, which means that if you are able to effectively manage time, your distress levels will be low. And it seems to enhance well-being, in particular life satisfaction, to a greater extent than it does the performance itself. Now let's next move on to study skills. Now, academic stress is commonly experienced by most students. Effectively organize and manage time and adopt systematic study strategies from the beginning of the academic year. Now, how can one enhance study skills? So let's discuss in detail about academic reading, how can one improve concentration, how can one improve memory, dealing with exams and enhancing your motivation. So let's talk about academic reading first. First of all, find your best time, preferably when you feel energetic, focused and relaxed. Choose a quiet, uncluttered place. Keep all the materials close at hand that you would require to do your study. Start each study session with 10 minutes of review of the most recent material that you have read. This kind of brushes you over the topics that you have read in the past, gives you a momentum to read the fresh set of topics. Follow the SQ3R rule for studying, that is survey, find out as much as possible about the topic, question yourself and create doubts and solve those doubts to have a better understanding about the things that you're reading. Then read in detail, recite, that is you revise them and finally review eventually. So this SQ3R rule is extremely helpful in studying a new topic, remembering it as well as recollecting it. and make notes to organize your answers better. Now, improving concentration. First of all, participate actively in the class. Reserve a block time each day for your study. Vary the subjects you study in each session. Eat, exercise and rest adequately. Practice relaxation exercises and avoid studying when you're tired, bored or upset. Now, let's discuss about how one can try and improve memory. So the major reasons for forgetting are stress, anxiety, lack of revision, or memorizing the subject without understanding the subject. So summarizing is what you have learned in your own words helps. Okay, explaining the topic to a friend, have a question answer session. This basically enhances your understanding of a particular subject. So instead of memorizing the subject, try and enhance your understanding about the subject. Order and sort the information and organize them. It helps in remembering these things better when they are organized. Reading the same topic by different authors also facilitates better understanding. Connect the material to the earlier known information or a mental image known as cueing. Use mnemonics or acronyms, chunking, rhyming, etc. Now, chunking is a simple strategy which one can use. For example, if you were to remember these digits 1, 5, 2, 3, 5, 8, it's difficult to remember. But if you then chunk them together as 1, 5, 2, 3, 5, 8, it's easier to remember. Right. Let's talk about dealing with exams. So familiarize yourself with the syllabus and the previous year papers that you have. Prepare a realistic timetable. Maintain a healthy lifestyle. Focus on the exam and not on the results. A lot of times students are just too focused about what the result is going to be. So the focus should be about preparing well for the exams and then leaving it for a later time to think about the results after your exams are done. Practice tests with previous year papers. If you don't know the answer to a question, do not panic and don't catastrophize that you're going to fail this exam just because you do not know the answer to 1 or 2 questions. Try to focus on the next paper and avoid discussing papers soon after the exams if that makes you anxious. Next is enhancing your motivation. So set a long-term goal and then have small targets to achieve that long-term goal. And once these small targets are achieved, reward yourself, which kind of pushes you to go towards the next target. And persevere, which means satisfaction comes as much from pursuing the goals rather than achieving it. So you need to kind of relish those small targets that you have met before you could meet the larger goal. Deal with your procrastination. Always remember, acting on your work generates the drive for further action. So if you are procrastinating, you will never move towards your goal. Observe yourself. Bring your motivated image to your mind as you take up challenging activities. Now let's discuss another important topic here, which is emotions, which also kind of determines how your mental health is going to be. So emotions are nothing but internal conscious states that we infer in ourselves and others. There are 4 components of emotions, that is feelings, bodily arousal, purposive component and social expressive component. We'll be talking about it now. So feelings are emotions that is nothing but subjective to oneself, where an individual has given a meaning or a personal experience to. Whereas bodily arousal is the biological activation. For example, I'm feeling happy and I also start feeling that I'm having some palpitations, or I'm feeling angry and I'm having some racing heart rate or palpitation. So that is bodily arousal. Purposive component means to give emotions its goal-directed force. That means to say that if I'm angry at somebody, then I'll probably go and talk to that person. So the purposive component is basically the one which gives the emotion, that is of anger, its goal-directed force, and social expressive component, which is either verbal or non-verbal communication. Now, the importance of emotions is that it is, first of all, important for one to understand one's own feelings in order to understand one's behavior. If I'm behaving in a particular way, for example, I'm being hostile or I'm being agitated, it could be because somewhere I'm angry within. So I need to understand my own emotions in order to understand my own behavior. Now, internal reflection and understanding what others feel by the way they communicate through their behavior. For example, if I see somebody agitated or restless, then I should be able to understand that, it's possibly because he's somewhere angry or upset within. So it also helps understanding others' behaviors, and it facilitates understanding oneself and others better. Now let's move on to another factor which influences mental health, and in general, university students, that is memory. So memory is our ability to encode, store, retain, and subsequently recall information and past experiences in the human brain. So memory is some of what we remember and gives us the capability to learn and adapt from our previous experiences as well as build relationships. Now, Atkinson and Shiffrin gave the stage model of memory in 1968. So this theory outlines 3 separate stages of memory. The first stage is sensory memory. So any sensory information from the environment basically is going to be received by the body and stored for a very brief period, generally no longer than 0.5 seconds for visual information and 2 seconds for auditory information. Now we attend only to certain aspects of the sensory memory. There are so many things in our environment, but we attend only to specific sensory information, allowing some of this information to pass into the next stage, which is the short-term memory. So kindly understand that only some part of the sensory memory to which one has given attention to actually moves on to the next stage, which is short-term memory. Now, the short-term memory is where most of the information is stored for 15 to 30 seconds if rehearsal is prevented. That means to say, if one rehearses the short-term memory, then it is likely to move on further. Okay, and any form of distraction prevents this rehearsal. It is also elicited by a commonly used task which we do, that is Brown-Patterson's task. So what I'd like to emphasize here is that if there is any form of distraction at the time of this rehearsal, then the further processing of this memory might be impaired. Now the capacity according to Miller for short-term memory is 7 plus or minus 2 items. Next, let's move on to the long-term memory. Now long-term memory has unlimited capacity and lasts for an indefinite duration. And this conversion of short-term memory to long-term memory happens through rehearsal. Now there are 3 types of rehearsals. One is shallow processing, which is nothing but the rote memory or memorizing. Then there is phonemic processing, that is of sounds. And then there is semantic processing. In semantic processing, basically there is a deeper understanding of the subject, and it is considered to be the best form of rehearsal for the memory to stay for a longer period in the long-term memory, right? So the same thing has been highlighted here in this stage model of memory. You can see there are external stimulus, then there is a sensory memory. Most of the things are forgotten. However, to the things on which attention has been given, there will be an initial processing, and then this memory would go into the short-term memory. Again, if there is no rehearsal, it is forgotten. But if there is any form of rehearsal, then it enters the long-term memory. Okay. Now, let's move on to another related topic, and again an important topic, that is principles and components of learning. Okay. So, learning is development of a relatively lasting change in behavior as a result of a single or repeated experience. Now, there are various types of learnings. That is non-associative and associative learning. Now, in non-associative learning, we have habituation and sensitization. Habituation is nothing but repeated stimulation leads to reduction in response over time. Example, if somebody is living in a railway quarter and they constantly keep hearing the trains, moving of the trains and the whistles, slowly they stop paying heed to those kind of stimuli because it is not important for them to do so. So because there is repeated stimulation, that is of the whistles of this train, there is a reduction in the response over time. So this is habituation. The other form of non-associative learning is sensitization, which is just the opposite. Increase in response to a stimulus as a function of repeated presentation of that stimuli. For example, a mother is sensitized to the cry of a baby. So even if she is in deep sleep, she is in a far away room, she'll still be able to hear the cry of her baby. This is through sensitization. So these are non-associative forms of learning. Now there are some associative learning as well. One is the classical conditioning, which we have commonly come across in the Pavlov's experiment, wherein repeated temporal association of two events basically clubs them together. So this was seen wherein a dog was initially given food, and then they started clubbing it with the ringing of a bell. So basically later what they found was that just the ringing of the bell would produce salivation in the dog. So there is two events are basically being associated because of repeated temporal associations. Now there is another kind of learning, that is operant conditioning, wherein there is learning which results from consequences of one's actions. And finally you have social learning theory, which combines both classical and operant models and includes cognitive processes, that is thought processes, as well as the social interactions which are relevant to human learning. Now, some of the applications of these learning processes is the Primack's principle or the grandma's rule. That is, high frequency behaviors can be used to reinforce low frequency behaviors. That is, for example, kids generally enjoy watching television. So if you ask them to finish their homework before they can actually watch television, they are also increasing the frequency of completing the homework. Okay, so this one can also utilize while one is preparing for exams or doing your daily activities. Another one is covert reinforcement. Now, covert reinforcement basically is the reinforcer is an imagined pleasant event rather than any material. For example, imagining passing the exam to reinforce the behavior of reading. This is covert reinforcement. There is something called as covert sensitization. That is, the reinforcer is an imagined unpleasant event that reduces the frequency of an undesired behavior. That is, example, a student might reduce continuing wasting time, say on playing video games, by imagining to fail in the exam. Right. Now, finally, let's talk about how one can distinguish normality and abnormality. And this is also a stage where I would like to give some introduction to the subsequent classes that you're going to have in psychiatry. So, distinguishing normality and abnormality is quite complex, but let's try to break it down into the 4 Ds, that is deviance, distress, dysfunction and danger. So any form of deviance, when an individual is being extremely different, any form of extreme behaviors, unusual behaviors or bizarre behavior can be abnormal. Not necessarily, but can be abnormal. Alright, then there is distress. If anything is extremely unpleasant, upsetting, okay, where an individual feels extremely distressed, can be abnormal. Dysfunction, like interfering with the ability to carry out daily activities which one was able to otherwise do. And danger is being dangerous to self or others. Now, in the subsequent classes, you will learn more about how to identify what exactly is abnormal and act for those things, but this is just a premise on which you can understand how to distinguish normality and abnormality. Now, it represents basically a deviation from the social norms and which interferes with optimal functioning and growth. Now, there are various factors like biological factors, psychological and social factors which play a role in these psychological disorders, and they are basically classified using the ICD or the DSM criteria, and all of this will be dealt with in the future classes. So I would like to end my presentation here. Thank you.